Anyway, we're chapter 39 of Isaiah, and we'll begin with a quick prayer. Father, we ask your guidance for our political leaders around the world. We ask that they may lead us away from war and show concern for the people in each of our countries. We ask that the violence in our own society may be lessened. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus, our Lord. Amen. Okay, 39. Now what happens, remember, there was a siege of Jerusalem, and Hezekiah, the king, was sick. And so the siege was broken because of the sickness, probably. And then Hezekiah prayed to God, and he was released from his sickness. So now that's all behind us, and we're going on now. At that time, this 39:1, the king of Babylon, Marduk-Baladan, son of Baladan, sent letters and a gift to Hezekiah, for he had heard of his illness and his recovery. And it's, I think it's a funny thing that sort of thing in terms of governments and royalty sort of goes on, these ongoing gifts. I don't know if I told you the book Church of Spies. Did I tell you about that book at all? Church of Spies, when a pope dies, 50 years after he's dead, they're allowed to publish, his papers are opened. So people who want to go to the Vatican and stuff can see the papers. And so one of the big things about Pius XII was that, he'd been in Germany as the papal ambassador for a while. And he had an acquaintance with Hitler largely before he came to power. And they record that he sent a birthday card to Hitler every birthday of Hitler as it went along. But simultaneously, the book is about Pius XII engineering 4 attempts on Hitler's life, all of which failed. One of them being Valkyrie. That was one that he did. But the book is amazing, and probably a third of the book is documentation. But 2/3 of the book is just a really, really, thing. And this idea of sending greetings and things between royalty and stuff like that doesn't mean anything. It's just, for show or whatever. Anyway, Hezekiah was delighted at this and showed the ambassadors his entire treasury, the gold, the silver, precious oil, his armory as well, and everything to be seen in his storehouses. There was nothing in his palace or in his whole domain that Hezekiah did not show them. Okay? So that he's basically shown them the wealth that exists in the city of Jerusalem. And it's hard to imagine showing that to someone who has just recently been sieging your country. But Hezekiah at this time, I think, is so relieved by the army being gone and by his recovery of his illness that he's just not acting sensibly. Okay? The prophet Isaiah then came to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What have these men said? And from where have they come to you?" Hezekiah answered, "They've come from a distant land, from Babylon." Isaiah said, "What have they seen in your palace?" Isaiah answered, "They've seen everything in my palace. There's nothing in my storehouses that I have not shown them." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Listen to the word of the Lord Sabaoth. Look, the days are coming when everything in your palace, everything that your ancestors amassed until now, will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. Children sprung from you, sons begotten by you, will be taken to be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." And what obviously is seen is that when these, these emissaries came, Hezekiah, rather than attributing the deliverance to God, which, they got sick and they just abandoned it, but rather than attributing the deliverance to God, he starts advertising how great he is and how powerful he is and how wonderful he is. He sort of sets himself up, even when, particularly with the recovery from the illness, it was very obviously a petition that he gave to God and a petition that God answered. But no, he sort of sets himself up as this great person. Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord that you announce is good." He is thinking, there will be peace and security in my time. Okay? So he sees this disaster coming after him, as actually it did historically. But he sees it coming after him. But you heard in it that his sons are going to be taken to be prisoners and will be servants in the court. Somehow that doesn't seem to bother him. And it sort of gives you an insight into the character himself. I mean, there's something not really, and this was one of the best kings Israel ever had. And there's just something not right with him. So the next thing is probably one of the most quoted of all the passages in Isaiah. It's chapter 40. And this is called historically the consolation of Israel. Okay? And so it begins with actually the vocation of the prophet, where God speaks. And God speaks to Isaiah and says, "Comfort. O comfort my people, says your God." So I think one of the things to see here, if you go through these mandates that God gives prophets, they're really interesting. Even when something, strong or strict or something has to be said, they're always told to be able to say it in a certain way. But I look at this, I say that the principal purpose of preaching is to give comfort, and in the process to reform people. But from a preaching point of view, I think personally that I have the idea that if I really need to say something to a person about something that's going on or something, if I cannot say it in a way that comforts them, it's not my job to say it. Someone else should say it. You should be able to speak, in terms of comfort. And so the first thing he's done is called to comfort the people. And then he says, "Speak to the heart of Jerusalem and cry out to her that her period of service is ended. Her penalty has been paid. From the hand of the Lord she's received double for all her sins." So in their difficulty, you're supposed to comfort them, and you're supposed to assure them that their sin has been made up. Now, in the course of Israel, what it's basically talking about is the sufferings that they've gone through under the siege and then ultimately the conquest of Babylon. That this sort of thing is more than enough punishment with regards to what they've gone through. But remember, in our tradition, it's basically speaking of Jesus, because it's Jesus' suffering that saved us. It's Jesus' suffering that makes up ultimately for everyone's sins, really. And he goes on, he says, "A voice cries out in the desert, prepare a way for the Lord." And this is the classic call of John the Baptizer, that he's the voice that comes out of the desert. From what we know of John the Baptizer, it appears as though he was, as a little tiny baby. I think that originally, when you look at the scriptures, originally in the text, that it was the firstborn child that had to be ransomed. And the reason is the firstborn in Egypt at their leaving, the firstborn child of everything, of animals, of everything, died. And not the Jews. So they saw the firstborn as belonging to God. And in the case of sheep, the first lamb born to any ewe, that had to be sacrificed. And any animals, it even applied to trees. If you planted an apple tree, the first year you had apples, all those apples had to be given to the temple. Then after that, the tithe. But the first time is all, it's the sacrifice at the first of everything, sort of belongs to God. In the case of a child, you would take the child to the temple and you would hand the child to the priest. And once you handed the child to the priest, then you would be given the opportunity to ransom the child. If you were wealthy, you would ransom the child with a lamb. And if you were poor, you would ransom the child with a pigeon. And I think you know the story in Luke about them taking the two pigeons. Or Luke has mixed two stories. One is what we call the churching of a woman, which is the sacrifice in the Jewish tradition. The birth of a child entails the shedding of blood. So the woman needs to be purified. So one is for the purification, the other is for the ransom for the child. But what most people don't even think about with this, you don't have to ransom the child. Like if you remember the story of Samuel, when his mother took Samuel to the priest, they left him there. They saw Samuel as a special gift from God who was to be raised and thing. That appears to be what happened to John the Baptizer. John the Baptizer's father was a priest, and so he was left in the temple. This child left in the temple then was raised at Qumran, and an awful lot of the children of the priests, the male children of the priests, would be raised in Qumran. And the reason is that Qumran was down by the Dead Sea, and it was a purely Jewish community. The Romans, it wasn't worth their effort to go down there, so they didn't care about it. And so Qumran, the ones that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff like that, they stayed right there. But if you wanted a child raised in a perfect Jewish environment, that was the place to go. And so the priests wanted their children raised that way, so they were there. And when John the Baptizer began to preach, if you were to look at a map and see where Qumran is, John the Baptizer began to walk toward the Jordan River, and he stopped at the first thing that comes off the Jordan River. He stopped at the first fresh water you would reach from Qumran. And in Qumran, the whole devotion thing was bathing. They would have, their morning prayer was a bath they took. Before each meal, they took a bath. It's called a mikveh. But they used to do this in everything during the day. That was their prayer. Jews do it on occasion for like before a marriage and stuff like that. But at Qumran, they did it. That was their daily prayer all the way through. So anyway, that's where John the Baptizer learned that. And then when he started out, this was his. And he was the voice crying out. And what was he crying? Is preparing the way of the Lord. Okay? And understand this I don't know about anyone else. I'm a highly visual person. And every time I talk about this preparing the way of the Lord, what I have in my mind is curling. I don't know, have any of you ever seen curling? It's a game in Canada particularly, where you slide a stone along ice, and you want to get it as close to a point but not beyond it. And there are two people in it. There are actually three people. The one who throws the stone and two assistants who sweep the ice in front of the stone. And if you don't sweep the ice, it slows the stone down. If you sweep it, and then it keeps it going fast. So you have to figure out how, but that's kind of what John the Baptizer was doing. And what he was doing is that in order to receive the Lord is open to coming to everybody and this sort of thing, but you need to prepare the way for the Lord. There needs to be some kind of of welcoming. And it's very interesting when you watch historically how the Lord comes to people. You see someone totally away from the whole thing, which was Paul. But if you look at Paul was a deeply devoted Jew who believed the Christians were deforming the faith. Paul was not a bad person at all. He was a person who was seeking God. So God arrested him in his situation. And my favorite story, if you've ever read has anyone here read the Autobiography of Dorothy Day? Because Dorothy Day speaks powerfully about her first experience was that she understood and taught communism. If you study communism today in school, you read books by Dorothy Day. She was a very, very academic approach to communism. But anyway, she went to Mass in a Catholic church. I think on Christmas, she had a friend of hers who was no more religious than she was. They just liked to go to midnight Mass on Christmas. And they went in and she was sitting there and she suddenly noticed that what she was trying to do in the communism thing was happening there. She says, you see homeless people sitting beside people dressed up in their Christmas finery, and you see all this. And she says she was thinking back at her communist gatherings. They were all these young radicals. She says they were all the same. But this idea of creating that community happens in the church. That's how she was converted, just, that experience. But what was her preparation? Her preparation was that she wanted really to do something good to draw people together in equality, and she thought it was communism. And so but she had prepared the path of the Lord, and so God came to her. But this idea that people really need to prepare the path, and I think people have gone all different directions down paths and found themselves arrested or converted by God because they were sincerely seeking the path, So if you're sincerely seeking the path, God can get you on the path. So anyway, he says, make straight across the wastelands a highway for our God. And that's the image of when a king visits a city. They would always repair the road, make it look good and this sort of thing. But there was no real advantage to have the road into the city very well repaired, because it would be good for an army to come into the city. So you didn't do it. But if the king was visiting, you did this sort of thing. Let every ravine be filled in, every mountain and hill brought down. And obviously, that's the whole process of making a straight path, that you fill the valleys by pulling down the mountains. So you make it all even. Crooked ways shall be straight, and rough places a plain. So whatever it is that will facilitate this access to God. One of the, one of the philosophers, he may even be Jewish, but he's one of the philosophers historically, says that all of human life is actually a search for God. And he says in some people it's disguised as a search for wisdom. In some people it's disguised as a search for knowledge. Some people it's disguised as a search for science. Some people it's disguised as a search for power. But he says ultimately what everyone is doing is seeking God. And he says that if that's what you're about, he will find you no matter what path you're on. And this is kind of what's going on here. He says, then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all humanity shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Two things to notice here is that first, that the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all humanity shall see it together. That only after the arrival of Jesus did we begin to notice in the scriptures that the promises that are connected to Israel are expanded to the Gentiles, okay? That we understand that now with the call that came. But it's very interesting to me that Christianity went on from there, and suddenly if someone wasn't baptized, then they were outside that. And you have to realize that the ultimate call of God is to everyone, everywhere, in every situation. The call of God is not limited in any way when God calls forth. In fact, if you read the Pope's letter on nature, you realize that the call of God is no less intense to nature as it is to all the people on the face of the earth. I think that's one of the real things that ecology is teaching us, is that the universe is an interconnected reality under the authority of God. And I think it's strange to me that we tend to think it's just us and no one else. And that's a very strong thing. And it's becoming stronger in our own country, this separation of things. But anyway, the idea is that God is not pleased with anything that divides people, period. Anything that's divisive, God would be against. And so all humanity shall see it together, and then the mouth of the God has spoken. So he says it very clear. A voice said, "Cry aloud." And I asked, "What shall I cry?" He says, "All humanity is grass. All its beauty is like wildflower. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows on them." And this idea of to understand, I think that one of the interesting things about aging is you become more aware of the shortness of human life. I think it's one of the craziest things when you look back is, that sitting in a classroom watching a clock, that, God, they move so slow, You think they have special clocks in classrooms or something. Because, when I'm on summer vacation, my clock is never going as slow as it is in a classroom. And yet, once you get further on, you realize how quick you have passed through all of that. And I think the older you are, the truer this thing about the fading of the grass and everything, the truer it reads. And it's not anything bad. Like, and the Native American thing is that you have to be very, very careful as viewing death as a horror and this sort of thing, because you have to go through it. You just don't have options, So death needs to be integrated into the way we think and this sort of thing, that it's all part of the game. And in the next part of this, the next verse is obviously an addition that someone else put in. And it's in parentheses here. If it's in parentheses, it means that it's a later edition that appears in more manuscripts than manuscripts where it's opposite. And if it appears in the footnote, it's missing from more manuscripts than it's present in. Okay? And they do that. So, like if you're reading it technically, you can tell that. So it says, "The grass is surely the people." So someone wrote in, so the grass refers to the people. Okay? He says, "Grass withers, a flower fades, but the word of our God stands firm forever." Okay? And I think the thing to see in this idea of the grass and things, that each one of us is given a life, and of different lengths, of different circumstances. No two lives, I think, have ever or will ever be exactly the same. They're just very, very different. The end of it, our life ends, our bodies, buried, this sort of thing. But the key thing is, what have you become in the process? It's not the process is different between growing and then getting old and dying. That process is the same. But it's remarkable the number of people who the process has turned bitter. It's remarkable the number of people who go through it in such great peace and just, like I remember my grandmother. My grandmother had a sixth sense about death. That one of the things that happened in our family is that each grandchild got to spend a 2-week vacation with my grandmother each year, and she could accommodate about 6 children at her house. She had the rooms for it because they had a large family that they had raised. And so you would go there. But I remember on 2 occasions when I was there, I was probably there through probably till about the age 10 or 11, okay? But I remember on 2 occasions, she got us all up, and we were to pray for a certain person. So we all prayed for the person, and then we went back to bed. But inevitably, the next day, we got a telegram about the person's death. And she just had this sense of it when it happened. And when she died, she prepared dinner for her husband, this sort of thing. And in the morning, she and her husband had separate bedrooms. And in the morning, when he went in to see her, she had gotten dressed in her best clothes, put on her makeup and everything, laid on top of the bed, hands across her, and died. But for her, the death that life's over, that's it, we've done it. But the question is always, what have you become through it? And that's the question we answer in the presence of God. There's this process, but don't hold to the process. Realize what's going to survive is you. The question is, what have I become? And not the question about my body, not the question about, all those kinds of things, or what you've accumulated or anything. But what have you become? That's the whole thing for the process. And as the word of the God stands forever, so you will stand forever. I will stand forever. But what has this process done to us, one way or another? He says, go up on a high mountain, Zion, herald of good news. Okay? So he says to go up on a high mountain, and the high mountain, he says, is Zion. Now, Zion's just one of the names for Jerusalem, the area of Jerusalem, which is on a mountain. But he says, herald of good news, that Jerusalem itself is supposed to be a herald of good news. And I think one of the things we find out over a period of time is that the greatest announcement of the good news of the gospel is actually seen by the way people live. And again, I cite the Dorothy Day business. That, did anyone come up to her and hand her a pamphlet, knock on the door, I'm Elder James? And no. What happened is she saw the community that exemplified what she was about through communism. And that's what he's saying, is this community, at this point, the Jewish community, is supposed to, by their life, by the way they live, to proclaim the gospel. And I think that Franciscan saying that you're called to proclaim the gospel, and when absolutely necessary, you may use words. But the whole thing, I've told you this before, that Mother Teresa, before she went to India, had to sign a paper that she would never teach religion, and she would never talk about the church. That's the only way they would let her in. And she made more converts than anyone's ever made over there. And she never taught about religion at all. So, he says that's what you're supposed to do. He says, lift up your voice with power, Jerusalem, herald of good news. And so when you speak with power, so that and I think a lot of this has to do with, I'll go to Mother Teresa again. That Mother Teresa always was a powerful and amazing witness. Whenever she was interviewed on TV or something, she was a powerful, powerful witness. And I remember she was called to speak at some really liberal women's college on the East Coast. And she talked about abortion, that she was clear and this sort of thing, and she always was this really powerful voice. And yet, when you read her diaries that she kept, she was going through a period of terrible suffering, not just physical, but emotionally. She says she had the feeling that God had abandoned her and this sort of thing. Not the belief, she knew God hadn't, but the feeling was gone. And that if you study, what do you call it, mysticism and stuff like that, that's called the dark night of the soul. And it's a process. John of the Cross says that initially when people turn to God, it's a very euphoric thing. And God gives very powerful rewards to people in that process, so that when you turn to God, you somehow feel really wonderful when you pray and this sort of thing. And he says all of that begins to diminish. And the question is, God wonders, are you in love with the feeling, or are you in love with me? And that's called the dark night of the soul. And it appears in the ending part of many of the saints' lives. John of the Cross went through it, and so it was over. In the rest of his life, he felt this very close association with God. But most saints I've read autobiographically die in it. They die in that process. So you're supposed to speak the powerful voice irrespective of how you feel at a time. That should be this powerful. He says, lift it up without fear. And it's this is a unique time in this country. I have never watched in the United States. I've never in my life seen fear used as such a weapon against people today. That that if you don't like what a library is doing, it's not a matter of writing a letter or talking to people in the library. You have a riot, you burn books. If you don't like what a teacher is doing, you try and get her removed. It's a very, very thing. And it's fear that people prey on fear. One of the things you learn in psychology is that when you make a decision based on fear, it's almost inevitably wrong. Fear causes us to make bad decisions. So he said, say to the cities of Judah, see, here is your God. See the Lord God coming with power. His arm rules for him. See his reward with him. His prize goes before him. And this idea of having confidence in God's moving for your benefit, okay? And whatever that will be. It's much easier for us somehow to trust in that with a belief in everlasting life than it was for the Jewish community. The Jewish community never had a solid, approach to everlasting life. It wasn't, I don't think it is today, doctrinaire. It's not a doctrine. I would say a number of people do believe in it, but it's not a doctrine of theirs like it is for ours. And so it's oftentimes difficult to see things work out on the face of the earth. And I think the Jews held sort of that everything kind of worked out on the face of the earth, but the glitch to all of that was when the book of Job was accepted into the Bible. Because the book of Job, you go through and you see Job is a good man, an excellent man in the presence of God, and he pays a terrible price as he goes through his life. And I think I mentioned before that one of the things in the book of Job, they resolve it by, he has a new family, new children and stuff, but no one who has ever lost a child will think you could ever replace a child with another one. So he has a life of punishment. And he's a good man. And of course we see that in Jesus, He's the perfect man and a life of terrible suffering. So, but this idea that ultimately God's coming towards me and God is coming in my favor, irrespective of what's going on in my life and this sort of thing. God is advancing to me, and he's advancing for my benefit and in my favor. He says, he tends his flock like a shepherd, gathering the lambs in his arms, holding them against his breast, and leading the mother ewes. And the image of the shepherd, I think it's important for us to understand the image of the shepherd that we carry in our tradition is Basque. And the Basques, a lot of them came to be shepherding people in our area. And they tend to drive huge flocks of sheep. And today they use like three-wheelers and stuff to herd them with the dogs and stuff like that. But in Israel, a flock of sheep was usually 12 to 15 sheep. And it's because the grass and stuff is so sparse. And so you would take off your little group of sheep to the area. And shepherds in Israel never drove sheep. That what you would do as soon as a lamb is born, you would put the lamb around your neck and you would mark the lamb to your voice. Because the lamb normally is marked to the ewe's bleat. And you don't. You mark the lamb to your voice. And then if you go, all you'd have to do is keep talking. They'll all follow you because they're marked to that. And in fact, that's the big thing about David. David, the way he did it, he sang. And it's interesting that when he then became king, he's the one who introduced music to the liturgy, that he brought in the sort of thing, music like that. So he says that God comes, and he comes like a shepherd. A shepherd guides sheep. The shepherd knows where the sheep are supposed to go, and he gets the sheep there. But he doesn't do it by beating them, okay? He's leading them. He's all kinds of ways of getting them there. But they go through that. One of the things I used to amaze me in Israel was you'd see two shepherds leading their little group of sheep, and they cross paths. And as they cross paths, the sheep get all mixed up, and they don't stop walking. They keep going. The sheep sort themselves out, and then they're with the appropriate shepherd. It's just remarkable to watch. So he says, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and calculated the heavens to a hand's breadth, gauged the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in balance? And so what he's talking about, he says this God is coming towards you for your benefit. And now he goes through who can compare with God. Who else knows the universe? You know, like even today when we take a massive thing like the new telescopes, they can only see so far, and they know it's not at the end. But they can only see so far. We can only do so much. We only live so long. We could talk forever about human limits. And that is the thing that separates us from God, that we have limits and he does not, endlessly. One of the things that St. Augustine said is that you cannot say anything positive about God and be right. It's the negative things about God that are right. Like if you say God is good, the word good does not really embody anything about God. If you say he's not bad, you're right. If you say God's truthful enough, well, you know, God isn't just truthful enough. God is truth. I mean, it's not possible for the word. If you say he doesn't lie, you're right. The negative things. And to just understand this thing of the power of God. There's I forget which one of the Holocaust, we had a couple of professors at Berkeley who'd been in the Holocaust, a couple of, in fact, they've written books and stuff like that. But one of them told us one time that he always thought in his mind all the time, he held this concept of the power of God. You know, like that bullet could stop me, but not my God. That army can oppress me, but not God. That he always held that his weakness was seen to him as set aside beside the power of God, and that you learn to rely on God's power, not yours, in that situation. But anyway, so he goes on. He says, "Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord or instructed him as a counselor?" I really like that. Can you imagine who God would go to for advice? That this just is not God that knows it. "Who has he consulted to enlighten him, to instruct him in the path of judgment, to teach him knowledge, or to show him the way of discernment?" Okay? And what they're getting at is that, and this is the common way of thinking, we think of a teacher as more knowledgeable or better at everything than the student. But if you teach, you don't think that way. Because you would like, when you finish teaching a group of kids, that they know more than you do. That's what education is about, So like if you're teaching 5th grade, none of those kids will know more than you do, but hopefully they know more than you did in 5th grade. And then they can go on that way, this sort of thing. But this idea that the teacher being above the student is the way I think students think, but this isn't the way a teacher thinks. It says, "See, the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They count as dust on the scales." And whenever we see the word nations in the plural, he's talking Gentiles, okay? So he says, "Sea, coasts, and islands weigh no more than fine powder. Lebanon does not have enough fuel, nor do its animals suffice for the burnt offering." And the fuel is fuel for the temple in order to sacrifice. So he says, Lebanon, who's famous for the cedars, so that Lebanon was the forest of wood for that whole part of the world. And it says, all the wood of Lebanon is not enough for the fires we would need for the sacrifices that God deserves. And even if you had the fire, they don't have enough animals. But there's nothing we could render to God for what he's done. He says, all the nations are as nothing before him. They count as nothing and emptiness to him. And when we think of this nations thing, think of Israel largely looking at their enemies. They count as nothing. As a matter of fact, to God, there's no one who counts as nothing, okay? In fact, I don't think there's anything in nature that counts as nothing when you think of God. But this idea of his identifying with what he's done. He goes on, to whom can you compare God? To what image can you find for him? And in history and in theology and everything, we always try and deal with images of God. And we try and find ways to learn about God. The theology, the word theology means the study of God. We really study. But do you know what we do in theology? We actually study what God has told us about himself. We can't study God. So I know as much as I've been able to understand from God's revelation, but I need to know I don't understand God. Okay? And I think that's one of the errors that divides religions, when someone thinks they understand God, that's not good. He says the craftsman casts an idol. A goldsmith overlays it with gold and casts silver chains for it. Okay? Silver chains are to decorate it. Okay? So he does that. He says, the one put in charge of the offering chooses a piece of wood that will not rot. He then seeks out a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not totter. So he says he finds a piece of wood, and then he takes a piece of wood that won't rot, takes it, and has it carved. He says, do you not know or have you not heard? Were you not told from the very beginning? Have you not understood how the world was set upon its foundations? He who sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. This inhabitants are like grasshoppers is something, again, that was added later. Okay. Stretches out the sky like cloth, spreads it out like a tent to live in. And so he talks about this God is the one who put all this together, the whole thing. And in Jewish tradition, that's the foundation for the Ten Commandments. God, who created the whole thing, is the only one who knows how it works. That's why we get the commandments. That's how our universe works. He says, he reduces princes to nothing and rulers of the world to emptiness. And I always think of it in terms of sports, that if you, you see this in schools, for instance. If you're in a little tiny school, let's say you're a little high school in San Luis Obispo, for instance, and you're a really good sportsman and you stand out as a powerful and wonderful sportsman and everything here. Well, if you get drafted into the football in UCLA, you are not going to stand out there. You know, the people of all this caliber. And I oftentimes think let's use the United States. A president of the United States can stand out as very powerful. In fact, except during the last president's administration, probably the most powerful man in the entire world. Okay, a lot of the literature coming out now is that during the last administration, the most powerful person in the entire world was Angela Merkel, that she was the one who people were referring to and stuff. But anyway, usually it's the president of the United States, but still you can't compare him to God. You know, like if God called a meeting, Biden would not chair it. Okay, that's true. He said, scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the soil. When he blows on them, they wither, and the storm carries them away like chaff. The idea, no matter how important they are, ultimately it ends. Death ends, or they're, unelected, whatever. But this whole thing, ultimately, it all ends. And to remember, in all of this, what we're trying to do is establish the power, the glory of God. Not to tear down people, but to realize there's always something more powerful and above us. So why don't we stop there? And it's going to go on in a similar attitude after that. We're stopping at chapter 40, verse 25.